Welcome everybody to the Decolonising Truth seminar series that is jointly run by the Alfred Deakin Institute and the Institute for Postcolonial Studies. My name is Yin Paradis. I'm Professor of Race Relations at Deakin University and the Alfred Deakin Institute, and I'll be chairing today's keynote session with Professor Lyndall Ryan. I will just start off by acknowledging country, acknowledging the Wurundjeri Wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations on the country that I'm situated on, and acknowledging country for everyone else on this call, and paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So today we are lucky enough to have Professor Ryan talking to us in this series. For those of you who don't know her, she's very well known for her work as a historian of the Australian colonial frontier, including books like The Aboriginal Tasmanians and other work on Tasmania in particular. Most recently, of course, work on the digital mapping of massacre sites across Australia. And that work has been going on for some years and continues to this day, with more and more work being done, including a launch, I think late last year, of stage 3 of the map. So I will hand over to Lyndall to talk. If you have any questions as we go, you can post those in the chat and we'll come back to those at the end. Just letting you know that this session will be recorded and will be available on the ADI and IPCS websites at the conclusion of the series. So over to you, Lyndall.
Thank you very much, Yin, and thank you for inviting me to give this morning's presentation at the symposium, Decolonising Truth. I would also like to acknowledge that I am on the lands of the Awakabal people in Newcastle, and to also pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. In my presentation this morning, I would like to give a brief background of the origins of the map, and then to give you a bit of an idea of the criteria that and methodology we have developed, the research team has developed to put sites of massacre on the map, perhaps offer a couple of illustrations of how one uses the map to examine particular massacre sites, and then I will conclude with some preliminary findings that the research team has made so far. As Yin pointed out, stage 3 was launched in November last year, and stage 4 will probably be launched perhaps in April 2021. That may be the final stage of the project, although it will always only be a map that is indicative of the frontier massacre sites in Australia rather than definitive. And we're hoping that this project will lead on to other projects in which some of the methodology from the map can be applied. So some background. The map emerged out of the history wars that were in full flight 20 years ago, which was really focused on the debate about whether there were many frontier massacres in Australia or simply just a well-known cluster. Mile Creek in New South Wales, Risdon Cove in Tasmania, the massacre at Pinjarra in Western Australia, and so on. That had always been there in Australian histories. The real debate was whether these were typical, whether they were the only ones, or whether they were simply one of many massacres that were taking place across Australia. To really explore that, the research team turned to the international literature on massacre, which had exploded in the late 1990s in the aftermath of the massacre at Srebrenica in Bosnia. in 1995. On that occasion, there were, in the village of Srebrenica, there were UN peacekeepers present, but they sort of didn't know what was going on. In that massacre, at least 500 Bosnian men were slaughtered over a period of a week by Serbian troops. It was all done behind closed doors in a range of buildings across the village and in underground cells. And it was 6 weeks before the details of that massacre started to emerge. And it really horrified scholars in Europe, first of all, who couldn't really come to terms with the fact that a massacre of this kind could take place in the civilized world of Europe. And secondly, that it took so long for the information about the massacre to reach the outside world. In 1995, the world was well and truly, that part of the world seemed to have massive media coverage. How did we not know what was going on? And that led scholars in Europe to start the study of massacre in its own right. And by about the year 2000, some 3 major characteristics started to emerge. First of all, a massacre is not an aberration. It's not a rush of blood to the head. It's not something that happens that you lose it. It's not like that at all. What they discovered was that looking at massacres across the ancient and the modern world, they found that massacres are carefully planned events, and they are largely designed to take place in secret. You are not, the outside world is not expected, is not really expected to know. The perpetrators and the survivors of massacre are very quiet in the immediate aftermath. Perpetrators don't speak out because they fear that the other perpetrators will kill them. And similarly with the survivors, they think that they will also be killed. So what they're finding, what the scholars found, is that the best information about massacre usually happens long afterwards. It might be 6 weeks later, it might be decades later. And it was with those characteristics that the research team began their idea of devising a digital map of massacre sites across Australia. And perhaps we might have the map now, if it's possible, could come up. I don't know if that's possible. Yep, okay. So that's the website, Colonial Frontier Massacres in Australia. You come up immediately with a bit of an introduction, and the introduction gives you the background to the map, and it discusses a definition of a frontier massacre in Australia. The research team concluded that the definition of a frontier massacre in Australia is the indiscriminate killing of at least 6 or more undefended people in one operation. And that has been the definition that has driven this project. And the introduction has quite a long section about how we've arrived at that definition and how we have deployed that definition. I haven't got time today to go into great detail. I think people are much more interested in how the map works. So maybe we could go onto the map now. So that'd be great. Give it time and the dots will come up. Okay, this is what the map is looking like at the end of stage 3. There are about 319 sites of frontier massacre. Most are identified with yellow dots, but there are some blue squares, and they are the massacres by Aboriginal people of settlers and so on. I won't talk about those in great detail today, but in Victoria, of course, there is one square, and that is the massacre at Benalla in April 1838, when 7 or 8 stock keepers were massacred by Aboriginal people. A lot has been written about that. All the squares relating to Aboriginal massacres of white people, each of those sites has an immense literature. They include the Maria Massacre in South Australia in 1840, the massacre of Hornet Bank and Cullen-Laringo in Queensland. Each has at least one, if not two or three books written about them. The massacres up in Cape York are usually on islands off Torres Strait relating to shipwrecks where the survivors were killed by Aboriginal people. And we have a few others. But my purpose today is to really talk about all of the yellow dots, or of the yellow dots, and how they got on the map. If you could just make the map a little bit smaller so that we can include Tasmania, please. Is that possible? Yes, that's great. What I would like to do now is just show you the timeline, which is a very useful thing to go back. I don't know whether I've been able to do that. Okay, let's start at the very beginning when in 1788, the first massacres actually happen in about 1794, just around in the Hawkesbury River region of Sydney, about 50 to 60 kilometres west of Sydney. The Hawkesbury River was the first area west of Sydney that was settled by former soldiers and convicts planting crops. They realised it was a very rich region. And although the first massacre was carried out by some local settlers, very quickly the colonial government decided that it would be soldiers who would defend the frontiers and carry out most of the massacres. So right up until the 1830s, most of the massacres, sorry, I'm not having great luck here. Most of the massacres are carried out by soldiers or soldiers with settlers, with local militia forces. And this takes us to the Black War in Tasmania and the wars around Bathurst in New South Wales. So the frontier is really being patrolled by British regiments that are stationed in Australia. But it's after that that the story changes quite dramatically. Let's go up to 1850, and we see this is when there is a dramatic increase in the massacres taking place. This is the period to 1850 when Victoria, or the Port Phillip district as it was then known, was opened up for pastoral settlement, and we can see that there is a great increase in massacre activity, similarly in northern New South Wales and what is now southern Queensland. But if we go up to 1860, we will see, and the research team has really divided the project into two parts. The period up to 1860, which includes most of southeastern Australia, parts of South Australia, and the southwestern part of Western Australia. This period up to 1860 sees quite a dramatic expansion of pastoral settlement, cattle and sheep, and the beginnings of mining, although in relation to Victoria, for example, where the gold rushes begin in 1851, just about all the massacres in Victoria are over. The same with Tasmania, they're well over by about the early 1830s, and many parts of New South Wales. In 1860, Queensland becomes a separate colony, and we see the opening up of the Northern Territory as part of South Australia, and by the 1880s, the northern part of Western Australia. So in dividing the project into two parts, we've been able to analyze the data more closely. But before I analyze the data, I'd just like to give a couple of examples of what happens when you click on the map. If we could, I understand that where we are at the Alfred Deakin Institute, we are based in North Melbourne. So the nearest massacre I can find to that is this dot here. And if I click on it, we might get some details. The map is a bit small for me at the moment. Yes, here we are. And this is the map. This is one of the early massacres in Victoria that took place. We've actually got a day. It happened on the 16th of July. It happened at Mount Cotterell, which is near Werribee, and it was of the Walterong people. We have the 10 people were Aboriginal people were killed. And the massacre was in reprisal for the Aboriginal killing of 2 colonisers. Those colonisers were not killed in the massacre, rather their killing were the preconditions for the massacre. So we've clicked on that, and that gives you some preliminary details. I'll now, just click on the full details, and we'll get the site name. So what we have with every site has a template that we have devised so that we can include basic information, and as more information becomes available, we'll be able to fill it in. So we have the site name. It is known as Mount Cotterell in Werribee. When we have the Aboriginal name for that site, that will be inserted. We know the language group. It was in the Port Phillip district, it was then known as the Port Phillip district, which is present day Victoria. It took place in the police district of Melbourne. We have the latitude and longitude for the site. We have the date. We're very fortunate to have the actual day, the 16th of July, 1836. Often in other sites, we might have the month, but we must always have the year. But many of the massacres data for Victoria, we have quite rich data. We can actually get it down to a day. The victims were Aboriginal people, and we know that at least 10 were killed. And it seems to have been men, women, and children from a clan of up to between 50 and 100 people. We know a lot about the attackers in this case, and I'll refer to that in a moment. We know that it was in reprisal for the killing of 2 particular settlers, Charles Franks and his servant Thomas Flinders, and they were killed on the 9th of July 1836, and their mutilated bodies were found. We know that the reprisal attackers were all on foot, which is a little bit unusual in Victoria, but I'll come back to that in a moment. It was a reprisal, and that the attackers carried muskets, and possibly they might have had also a cutlass, or they may have had a pistol as well, but we know that they had. But what we have is a narrative which tries to tell you the story of how it happened and who the perpetrators were and what happened in the aftermath. So it's quite a detailed story because it was well documented at the time, although, and there was an inquiry carried out by the magistrate Lonsdale, in which all of the perpetrators denied that they had killed anybody. But we have later information, we have information from the Colonial Secretary in Tasmania, strangely enough, who writes to the Colonial Secretary in Sydney and says actually there were 10 people who were killed. So I think that's quite interesting. And every story, every massacre has its own little story about how we find out more information. So it's very detailed, this one. It points out that these two settlers, well, a settler and his servant, shepherd, Thomas Flinders, who I think, by the way, could have been a Tasmanian Aboriginal person, but I won't go into that story today. But a party of 17 men went out in reprisal. It's a very interesting party. Some of them were settlers, some of them were Aboriginal people from Sydney that John Batman had brought across to Melbourne, and others were Victorian Aboriginal men. So it's a very interesting and complicated story that has been written about at great length by historians in Victoria. Perhaps the most recent one would be Thomas Rogers in his book published in 2016. So we've got quite a lot of information. William Lonsdale, the magistrate at Port Phillip from late September 1836, was instructed by the Colonial Secretary in Sydney to investigate the incident. He interviewed all of the men, and their interviews can be found in the Historical Records of Victoria, edited by Michael Cannon, and they all deny that they shot anybody, or they'd heard that someone was shot but didn't take any notice, and so on. So it's really the Colonial Secretary from Tasmania, then known as Van Diemen's Land, who really has the information. And I think that's very interesting. So we've got the sources. We've got the Historical Records of Victoria. We have the Cornwall Chronicle, which is a Launceston newspaper, which gives us great detail about how Franks and his servant were killed, his shepherd were killed, but gives us no detail about the massacre. So we're then reliant on subsequent research that has been done by James Boyce and by Thomas Rogers. It's an incident that is now widely accepted took place. We also have a visual of the area. That every massacre site has a visual, and we have a kind of area in which it took place. It is now looks very it looks like a treeless plain from the air. These are all taken from Google Air, of course. But a little bit of explanation about the site. It's quite a wide area. We think that it was an attack on the campsite that would have been near a waterhole, and that because it was an attack, it would have been an early morning attack when the people, the victims, were just waking up and therefore were largely sitting ducks. But the area is quite a wide area. The Aboriginal communities that we've been consulting during the course of putting the map together indicated that they did not want the actual waterhole there focused on. Many of the sites that are already on the map have been looted by vandals or extremely vandalized. They did not want this to continue. So what we have done is given the general area where the massacre happened. Some sites have a plaque, but not at the site itself. It might be on the roadside nearby. At Mile Creek, which is probably one of the best known massacre sites in Australia, and where an annual ceremony is held, it's held away from the site. There's a major interpretation centre now. It's very important, but the actual site is not where the service is held. And Aboriginal people are increasingly concerned that site looters are destroying what is there. So we have a big responsibility to indicate where it happened, but not the actual site where it happened. And Aboriginal people do not want people not to go out and have a look at the area where these awful incidents took place, but to really acknowledge that in many cases they are seen as sacred sites for Aboriginal people and would like respect paid. Unfortunately, that is yet to happen in most cases, and that's something that the research team has to take account of. Okay, let's move on. Let us go back to the map. What I'd like to do now is to draw some preliminary findings about the map. I'll see if we can click this off. Yes, okay. And what I'll do is go right up to the present. Okay. So in having had a look at Australia before 1860, we noticed that most of the massacres were in southeastern Australia and a few in the southwest of Western Australia and a few in South Australia. These are preliminary findings. In stage 4, we will have more sites in Northern Australia. So we've largely finished our research into this part of the world, but we're still researching this vast Northern Australia. Could you move the map down a little bit so we can get a little bit more of Northern Australia as well? That's perfect. Don't go, we don't want to lose Tasmania. Here we are. What we've been looking at now that we've got an array of massacre sites across Australia, the research team is realising that there are particular areas where the massacres are very intense. Certainly we've got the Midlands area of Tasmania during the Black War, where there's about 25 or 30 sites. In Victoria, the Western Districts is a very busy area where there's at least 30 sites. There'll be a few more in Gippsland. We notice the numbers along the Murray River. We're beginning to get characteristics of where the massacres happened. It's usually in relation to campsites along watercourses. It might be a lagoon, it might be a billabong, it could be a creek. It's where there is water. And of course, the massacres happened because there's largely a contest for water. As the pastoralists are bringing in sheep and cattle, there is a contest for water. And that's very important. We're also finding here in the East Kimberley, in Western Australia, and the Victoria River Downs area in the Northern Territory, there'll be a lot more to put on the map from those areas. We've the research team members in Darwin and in WA are building up those areas. So these are what we would now in today's language call major massacre hotspots. It looks like we've got at least 3 major hotspots: Tasmania, the Western Districts of Victoria, East Kimberley and the Victoria River Downs area. We are going to have more sites in this part of Queensland and probably more in southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales. These are all areas of large Aboriginal populations. These are all areas where settlers were taking up land with sheep and cattle at a very rapid rate. If we look at the Western Districts of Victoria, for example, the settlement is there. It begins in 1834 when the Hentys arrive at Portland, and by 1851, it's over. You know, there's no more. All the stations have been taken up. So it happens over a very intense period. It happens over a period of 10 to 15 years at the most. In Tasmania, it all happens over a period of about 7 to 10 years. In the Kimberley and Victoria River Downs, it begins in the 1880s, then it stops for a while around 1900, and then it takes off again after World War I. Droughts play a very big role in determining how and when massacres take place. The search for water, the contest for water is very dramatic and important factors to take account of. In the Kimberley, for example, the first settlers to move in hoped to breed horses, but the climate and the vegetation was not good for horses, so it was then quickly replaced with cattle. And then, of course, there's mining booms, mining rushes taking place in those areas as well. And we have a number of massacres that take place as a result of mining. We have a similar story here in North Queensland with the Palmer River rushes and other rushes. So mining and pastoralism are the big causes, preconditions for massacre in that part of the world. We've now got the research team also has some preliminary findings that I'd just like to briefly talk through before I conclude. What we found in Southern Australia, that is pre-1860, is that the colonial state has a greater involvement in the conduct of frontier massacres than the research team realised at the outset. And while from my work in Tasmania, I could see that British soldiers played a very significant role, I did not realise that they had such a significant role also in New South Wales. In Victoria, once the native police are established in the early 1840s, the native police are playing a greater role in the conduct of massacre than I realised. And of course, in Queensland, the native police are in action from the moment Queensland becomes a separate colony at the end of 1859. And the native police are playing a very significant role in the conduct of massacre. So what we found in pre-1860 is that of the massacres before 1860, at least half are carried out by agents of the state, soldiers, police, or as joint operations between settlers and police. I've found in northern New South Wales that mounted police operations often open up the area for settlement, and then the settlers and their stockmen come in and replicate what the mounted police have been doing. They've learned a lot from the mounted police. The other thing we have found is that as time moves on, between pre-1860 and post-1860, pre-1860, the average number of Aboriginal people killed in a massacre is, in Victoria, it's 30. In Tasmania, it's 13. In New South Wales, it's 25. And in South Australia, it's 10. We've also found that in Tasmania, the massacres are predominantly carried out on foot. That is a very strong feature. Pre-1830, most of the massacres in Australia are carried out by groups of men attacking campsites on foot. After 1830, most of the massacres are carried out on horseback, and the use of horses and the development of weapons that enables perpetrators to shoot from the back of a horse gives the perpetrators a huge advantage, which is why I think in Victoria it's very rare, apart from the Mount Cottrell massacre, it is very rare to find massacres carried out on foot. Most of them are carried out on horseback, which means that you can shoot more people more effectively. And I think that begins to show in the data that we've collected and analysed. Post-1850, post-1860 in Northern Australia, we're finding that the average number of people killed in a massacre moves from the mid-20s to to the mid-30s and the high 40s. So massacres are becoming better organised, the perpetrators are more experienced, and they're able to kill more people. The massacres are not only happening by attacks on Aboriginal campsites, but in the Kimberley and in the Victoria River Downs region, and in this little cluster over here, in northern South Australia and Western Queensland, these massacres are taking place when there are large gatherings of Aboriginal people who have come together for major ceremonial purposes, and the perpetrators wait until there are several hundred Aboriginal people gathered, and then they're attacked in daylight sometimes, and you get very high numbers of people killed. So they're becoming better organised military operations. We're finding also in this part of the Kimberley and the Northern Territory that they're more likely to be killed in major police patrols, where the patrols are going out for 6 weeks. They're carrying a lot of ammunition. They'll gather some stockmen along the way until they build up a group of about 20 or more, and can go in and attack an Aboriginal campsite and do a lot of damage. So the massacres become more brutal, more sophisticated, and more people are being killed in them. And perhaps just to, so that what we're finding that while the massacres never stop in this whole long period, they're becoming better organised and more brutal over time. I think I've talked long enough, and I'm sure that people will have questions, so I think I will conclude there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lyndall, for that quite upsetting presentation.
Yes, it is very upsetting.
Yeah. Are there any questions? I haven't seen anything on the chat.
Oh, okay.
But people may have questions that they would like to ask now in person. A question from Louise Johnson. Who are the other researchers in your research team?
I'm the leader of the team, and there are Jennifer Debenham is the senior research person. She's kind of the research manager. I have in Darwin, we have Dr. Robin Smith, and in Western Australia, I have got Dr. Chris Owen. So we're the kind of historians who are the data gatherers. We also have Dr. Bill Pascoe, who has built the website, the map, and he has a team of casual researchers. I think we have a couple working on it at the moment, who provide the, putting it crudely, the updated Excel sheets for the research team to enter the data. Over time, those Excel sheets have become incredibly sophisticated to enable us to put in the data more quickly and perhaps ask more questions of the data. I have to say that we should have had Bill Pascoe involved in the project from day one. If people are going to have other projects with digital maps, have your digital mapper with you on board from day one, because they ask important questions about how we collect the data, how we analyse the data, and how that analysis can be actually recorded on the map in some way. So when we began, the historians and the digital people were poles apart. over time, we've come to work together and respect each other's questions. And that has been probably for me the most exciting part of the project, is understanding how digital mappers work and how they like the information, or the data as they call it, to be recorded and presented so they can use it and upload it to the map. So that part I haven't really talked about in great detail, but it has been, of course, without Bill and his team, there would be no map. There would be no ways of recording it. We have had a digital cartographer, Mark Brown, who was the one who organised the visuals for each site, which we had no idea could be done. If you were starting now, digital technology continues to improve out of sight. You know, we would probably do it slightly differently if we were starting the project today. And the project will probably be rolled into other projects that are emerging from other projects that we're doing at the University of Newcastle. But there's no doubt that working with digital people has forced the rest of us as historians to understand how one can make information digitally available to anybody who's got access to the internet. The map works best on Google. Others have tried to use other search engines, but it really is designed for using all of the technology of Google.
Okay. Thank you. So there's more questions. This one to start with. Why
Yep.
did you choose 6 people to constitute a massacre?
Yes. The international literature suggests that any number between 2 and 10 is the it can be the basic definition of a frontier massacre. We selected 6 because we found from our research that most Aboriginal groups, the minimum Aboriginal groups, are extended families of up to 20. And if you kill 6 people from an extended family campsite of 20, that's 30% of those people. You knock out 30% in one operation, you are really destroying that extended family. They will never recover from that kind of sudden loss of life. That means that they're no longer able to hunt in the way that they used to, perform ceremonial, observe other obligations to country, or to reproduce in the same way. They will have to go and connect with other groups to do that. I have looked very closely at the North American literature, a Native American literature on massacre as well, and I've been very influenced by the Native American historian Barbara Ward, who argues that killing 30% of a campsite in one operation is called a fractal massacre, and it really has long-term consequences. What we found, however, is that the average number killed in massacres is well beyond the number 6. So while it's a minimum number, it's, you know, if we look at the Tasmania numbers, the average number killed in a massacre is 14. So it is really doing devastating damage to Aboriginal communities. It is then that they become vulnerable to fresh attack. And it's also in that situation, of course, that they become vulnerable to disease. And what we have also found in our research is that we're not finding Aboriginal communities suffering from disease then experiencing a massacre. Rather, the disease follows on from the massacre. And that has been a finding we hadn't expected to make.
That's very interesting. Yeah. It tips up a lot of the views of I guess, the impacts of disease.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. Well, I mean, I belong to the generation that was brought up to believe that most Aboriginal people had died from inadvertently introduced exotic disease that the settlers brought with them, but didn't deliberately introduce. We haven't really got any cases of deliberately introduced disease like smallpox, although the smallpox epidemic in Sydney is still very highly contentious amongst historians in Sydney, and some believe that it was sort of intentionally introduced. Others say it was unintentionally introduced, but the impact is, certainly the impact was horrendous. However,
mm,
where the first massacres take place out in the Hawkesbury, which is, 50 kilometres or more west of Sydney, the settlers are not noticing that Aboriginal people there had experienced the smallpox epidemic. Of course, smallpox leaves quite obvious physical marks. Now, I haven't sort of engaged with that literature or that debate, but certainly, and in Victoria, of course, historians like Richard Broome argue that smallpox had attacked the Aboriginal community in the years before white settlement arrived in Victoria. What I'm arguing is that we're not noticing in the massacres in Western Victoria that these people were ill when they were killed by massacre. They seem to have recovered, that they were surviving very well, but that in the aftermath of many of the massacres in Western Victoria, we do see influenza in those communities, the remnant communities that survive. So I think they're obviously very vulnerable. We have found from research, looking at overseas research, particularly in Europe, at the outbreak of World War II, a lot of research has been done on the aftermath of the invasion of Poland in 1939 by the Germans from the west and the Russians from the east. It is estimated that about 20 to 25% of the Polish population was killed in that invasion over a very short period of time, and that in the aftermath, disease was rampant. And I think that this, any community that is knocked for six in a very short period of time, the immediate aftermath is disease. And now that we're in the middle of a pandemic, I think we're learning which communities are the most vulnerable.
yes, yes, we are. There's been a few questions about the use of, or the potential use of oral histories and
Yeah,
archaeological
yeah.
evidence.
Okay, thank you for those questions. I'm glad they've been asked. Let's look at oral histories first. The project is using as evidence or data published material. This does not mean that oral histories cannot be used. And particularly in Northern Australia, there are many published oral histories. As soon as the portable tape recorder came into widespread use after World War II, anthropologists were out there recording the stories and experiences of Aboriginal people. And many of those have been published either in books or journal articles or in films and things like that. And we've certainly made a lot of use of that. In perhaps the best known massacre in the Northern Territory, which is Coniston, which took place in 1928, in which there is both evidence from white people and from Aboriginal people. And historians have conducted a great deal of oral histories with the survivors of Coniston, which have been published over a long period of time. So where the oral histories are published, we will use them. If they haven't been published, we can't use them. This is highly contentious business. When you're researching and claiming a massacre, you have to have evidence to show that it happened. That evidence has to be able to be accessed by anybody who wants to access it. So publication is the key. Archaeological evidence. Again, where archaeological research has been published, as it usually is, then we'll use it. However, there hasn't been a lot of archaeological research. There certainly has been important archaeological research in the Kimberley, in the East Kimberley area. In particular, there's one massacre called the Sturt Creek Massacre, which Aboriginal people talked about at great length. It took place in the 1920s. But when archaeologists were hired to investigate the site, and this work began in the 1990s, when they tried to uncover the site, all they could find were the carcasses of cattle carcasses. And that really shocked the Aboriginal people. But in 2016, the archaeologists went down further. They dug deeper and they found Aboriginal remains. What had happened is that the perpetrators had covered up the massacre with the bones of cattle. These are well-planned massacres. It's horrible. It's horrible. Perhaps the worst massacre we came across in the Kimberley was where Aboriginal men were chained up with neck chains and then sent out to gather wood, which they then brought back and were told to put in a pyre, and then kerosene was thrown over them and the wood pyre, they were burnt. And then the remains were dug into the ground and burnt again. The attempt to dispose of the evidence is another continuing feature of massacre. And it's awful that the 20th century massacres are more frightening and horrifying in that way.
Mm. Yeah. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. I will invite 1 or 2 additional questions to be asked actually verbally by people. So if you could raise your virtual hand, we can unmute you and you can ask a question in that way. If anyone would like to do that.
Hi, Yin. I think there were quite a few questions around disseminating this information in education and school. So maybe Lyndall can talk to that.
Yes.
Well, the important thing about the map, of course, it is available. People can get it up on their phones. I understand that it has been used in the classroom, largely in regional Australia. It has actually taken off quite well in a number of classrooms where people are able to look at massacres in the areas around near where they live. And that is, I think that's been a very important aspect to do. I understand that there has been moves to include aspects of the map in some primary school curriculum I understand in Victoria, although I haven't yet seen any evidence of it. I understand it is being discussed in Queensland. I think the map is still too soon, too new to be instantly getting into primary school curriculum. I understand that it has been referred to in a number of university courses and that the map is, essay questions have been set about using the map. But to be quite frank, I've really focused my time in getting sites on the map. I've certainly given a number of presentations about the map to history teachers associations in New South Wales and Queensland. There were a few others I was listed to give in 2020, but they'll be put back to 2021. I have also given presentations to judicial authorities, judges associations in New South Wales. So the map's not finished yet, it's a work in progress, and I think that people want to have time to look at the map, to work through it themselves. The response that we've had today is very common. People are shocked by what I have to say. And I have to be very careful how I do it because it is a big story. It is, the map is a tool for truth telling, and the truth is very unpleasant. It's very, very confronting. I come from a generation of Australians where I was told at school that when I grew up, there would be no Aboriginal people left because they would have died out from disease. And confronting that story and having to rethink that is, you know, it takes time to absorb. It takes time. And I think we're having to link the story of the frontier wars in Australia with some of the more brutal things that happened in Europe during World War II, the frontier wars in the United States, looking at the wars in New Zealand in the 19th century and in South Africa, and putting it in an imperial context as well. So the map opens up very big confronting questions that I think as Australians, we simply have not been prepared for. And I think it's probably going to take another generation before we can look at all of this research and stand back and understand it and connect it more readily with other aspects of Australian history. Some people have told me that the map has come to them like a bolt from the blue. They had no idea. And it is very hard to do. So I'm very well aware of that.
Yes. Well, on that note, we are at time.
Yes.
So I'd like to thank you once again for your presentation. This very important work, which hopefully will become widely disseminated in schools and universities and broadly amongst the populace. I think this sort of truth-telling is very confronting, but also very important for any conceptions of reconciliation that we may be pursuing.
Yes.
In this nation. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And these seminar recordings will be available at a future date if you'd like to circulate them to others who may also have much to learn from the work of Professor Ryan and others in our series.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure.